welcome to one of those interviews about upcoming speakers speaking at our upcoming conferences. And today we have Mr. Web Font himself. I think we could say that. Zach, do you feel fonty today?
Always. Just never ending.
Yeah, I do have to ask you right away. I was told that your favorite color is green and has always been green and will never change from green to anything else. How does it relate to web fonts?
It doesn't in any way unless you choose your font color to be green, in which case you should make sure that the color contrast ratio for your background is acceptable per accessibility guidelines.
Uh, that's
But
that's
yes, green.
That's very
Great.
cool. Well, Zach has been around for quite some while and dealing a lot with web fonts, but also recently static site generators and stuff, and still working in at Filament Group. I guess doing green stuff every now and again on the web, which is kind of nice. Zach, web font loading. How did we end up with this mess, and how are we going to get out of it?
No, it's just kind of like an obsession, right? It's web fonts are amazing and incredible, and good typography can make or break a website. And having a nice, unique font on your website can really make your brand stand out. So, getting that font to load in a nice way for as many of your customers or your visitors to your site as possible is really important to make your site seem professional. So, yeah, I think it's a big deal, and it's still a very interesting and unique problem to solve on the web.
Right. Now, if we look into web font loading options, and there have been a number of them at the moment for many years now. If you see, let's say, a project which kind of suffers from web font loading, where things that just feel slow, maybe there are too many typefaces and so on, what would be maybe a couple of low-hanging fruits that you would recommend to just take and to be able to really reduce weight, let's say, within a few hours? What would you recommend to do?
Yeah, I would make sure that they're using WAF2 to make sure that the file sizes are as small as possible. Make sure they're compressed. And if you can reduce any of those typefaces, if you can maybe get rid of a few of the weights or styles, that would be good too. But if not, you should preload the most important ones to make sure that they trigger quicker, sooner in your waterfall. Because when you send off a request earlier, you would assume that it would finish quicker as well. That may not be always the case, but it's good case to preload your most important fonts. And then use font display. So while the font is loading, you can show a fallback font so the text is readable while your font request is in flight. So those are some really easy things that you can do.
Yeah.
There's a bunch more complicated stuff you can do too.
Yeah, but actually, when we speak about preload, by the way, there have been a couple of articles and been quite a discussion about how many to preload and how much is too much. Because in the end, it's, as far as I remember, Chrome was over prioritizing those assets, and they were actually blocking rendering of the page coming or being loaded or requested even before CSS came in.
Yeah, so if you aren't using critical CSS, preloading can really hamper your CSS load. And if your styles aren't inlined, basically that can cause some performance problems. I know that Chrome is sort of looking into that and improving that. I think there were some bugs with app cache, which were causing some problems that I think those are getting resolved. So I think it will improve over time, but I would say try to not preload more than 2 or 3, just as a nice rule of thumb. 2 or 3 is a nice happy medium, and make those the Roman versions if you're using multiple fonts for a specific typeface, so that while those are loading, you'll get fake bold or fake italic. And when the real bold and real italic load later, then you'll see fewer reflow
Right. But
dimension
then,
changes.
as you're speaking about for bold and for italic, so actually talking about reflows maybe as well at this point, there are I think like 2 fundamental problems that keep showing up on every single website you go. One of them is that you end up with really strange renderings before bold or italic comes in. So it is for bold and for italic, and sometimes it looks really awkward, a little, well, maybe at least to me. And the other thing is a huge number of reflows. If you're using, let's say, book and medium and bold and all of those, These are kind of the two critical things that really disturb reading. And if you start reading and the fonts haven't kicked in yet, you end up really being jumping all over the place. How would you approach these two specific problems in your CSS?
Yeah, so the second problem when you're using a bunch of different font files, really the easiest thing you can do is look for a variable font. Variable fonts will sort of group all those together and you'll have a single reflow for your entire typeface family. But another thing you can do is, if a variable font isn't available, because they aren't super widespread yet, is to use the CSS font loading API to sort of group all those repaints together. And so you'll see sort of one, you can configure it however you want, but you can group them up to see as few as one per family. And that's usually the way I do it, is use CSS font loading API to sort of group those together so you don't see a bunch of disjointed reflows happening.
And coming back to the faux bold, faux italic, I mean, we also had a couple of articles highlighting how to deal with them best. What would you recommend to do there?
Yeah, so I would say that full bold and full italic are actually good tools to use as intermediate steps. And I've sort of detailed this on my blog in blog posts about FOFT, the flash of faux text. So you can use those as sort of intermediate steps if you preloaded your Roman font file until the real bold and the real italic have loaded. And that can minimize your reflow. It won't get rid of it altogether, but it can minimize it to make your page sort of move around less while the fonts are loading. So you can minimize that, but definitely don't use full bold and full italic as your final rendering. You don't want those to be in the final rendering of your page. So try and get rid of those if you can.
I remember vividly a while back, there were some sites, I remember vividly that moment, they were storing those wonderful web fonts in local storage, and sometimes you will also find them base64 encoded, and sometimes you will find them in app cache. So the question is, of course, service worker or HTTP cache, and what's the deal with HTTP cache? Why do so many developers decide it's a good idea, and it's probably a good idea, to put web fonts in the service workers cache?
I would say HTTP cache is good for a lot of use cases. Service worker cache can be more sticky, especially when users are sort of clearing cache or perhaps visiting it in a bunch of different contexts. I don't think service worker will help with that, but service worker can really help you make your fonts a little bit more sticky if you want them to be. And so if you're interested in repeat views, which are important, obviously, you should put your font files in service workers, because oftentimes they don't change all that often. Especially when you're local hosting, a lot of people don't. They sort of download the initial version of the font and then never go back to update it, which is a different problem. But yeah, so yeah, font files are really they're very, very static. They change infrequently. So putting them in service worker cache and making them extra sticky can be very helpful for page loads for sure.
For a while, we also obviously would be probably using some tools to do subsetting to avoid loading too many characters and so on. And I guess that if you have, let's say, a multilingual website where you have to support Cyrillic and Latin, you would split these fonts apart and load them based on the Unicode range property, right? So if there is like one character from those, then you will be loading them. But then it still brings up a question of what tools would you recommend to use for subsetting? There are so many. Some of them I felt are a little bit buggy. Or maybe in general, what tools do you use almost on a regular basis when it comes to, web fonts?
Yeah, so I use a tool that I built called Glyphhanger, which does a bunch of different stuff. It can analyze a static HTML page to see what characters are in it, and automatically subset your fonts to those characters. And it'll actually work across font families and font weights and font styles. So it's a really nice tool. There's another one that Peter Mueller has called Subfont, and it works very well and very nicely as well. And I think his will actually automatically local host your Google Fonts too, so you can sort of do some performance optimizations around Google Fonts, which is pretty nice. But again, these tools are static analysis, so you sort of have to be aware of all the glyphs that might be used on your site. So they're not great for user-generated content. So if you're doing something like user comments on a blog, for example, I wouldn't necessarily recommend subsetting aggressively. You can still subset per language, and split your font files up on larger Unicode ranges per language. And that's what Google Fonts does too. If you look at their inside their CSS file that you load, you'll see a bunch of different subset files inside of there. So yeah, that's some good techniques that I would recommend.
But also, especially if you look into larger sets, let's say Chinese Chinese fonts, maybe Indian as well, where you end up with megabytes of payload if you actually do choose to load a web font. Is there actually any way at all to deal with those, or is it also the reason why we don't find them that much in Southeast Asia, for example, and India?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that Google Noto exists. I don't know if you're aware of this font, but it's a system font that they're trying to put on as many devices as possible, and it sort of serves as many languages as they can put into it. They're trying to, I think, put every language inside of this system font, and it gives a nice fallback. But when you have giant web fonts, that's a huge performance problem. And one of the things that Jason Pimentel has really been talking about lately is progressive font enrichment, a way to sort of load a portion of a font and then chunk in more of the font progressively later, which is really nice. And really that was kind of introduced for this style of large internationalized fonts. But I'm sort of also very interested in it in terms of getting our first stage font to load as quick as possible using a very, very small subset, and then sort of chunking in more glyphs later on and sort of combining those using progressive font enrichment. I think it's going to be an amazing tool for performance, not just for giant fonts, but for very fast font loads as well. So I'm really, really curious how that's going to turn out, and I hope it's going to be
But,
good for that.
but at this point, it's just a proof of concept, I believe. It's not really, there is not like a
Right.
tool, or it's not even supported, right? But it's an interesting way of kind of building up the web font as you keep using the site, for example, right? And then you mentioned actually the first stage and second stage. I mean, not everybody might be familiar with what you mean by that. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about this technique of loading altogether.
Sure, yeah. So it's kind of similar to progressive font enrichment, but you're sort of doing it manually. You make a super aggressive subset of a very small number of characters, and this is sort of known as your first stage. And this is usually with your Roman font. And then you sort of preload that, get it to load as quick as possible, get it to render as quick as possible, and then you re-render your page using this web font. Or even better, you can get it to load before your first render, and so you won't see reflow for that web font at all. And then sort of as a second stage, you load your bold, your extra characters, your sort of fancy font features that you might want to load as more of a lazy loaded step. And you'll sort of blow away that first stage and sort of re-render using the second stage all the fancy font features that you might want. And it's just sort of a way of manually sort of loading fonts in two different stages. The downside to that, and what progressive font enrichment will hopefully solve, is that you're sort of all the bytes that you use to load your first stage are wasted. You basically throw those away when your second stage loads. So using progressive font enrichment to sort of combine those and save you some bytes on your second stage would be really nice.
Well, I remember those times where you would just plug in a font and link and then forget about it and just could go back home to your families and friends, and you could live like happily ever after. Now it's a little
Now
bit
we know
different.
better.
Now we know a little bit, yeah, now we know a little bit better. You did mention variable fonts. I'm wondering at this point if it's not actually a performance issue as well, because I mean, if we look into regular fonts, we have bold, italic, regular, and all of that. So we could essentially subset them. But how would you subset a variable font? Would you create some sort of restrict the dimensions in which it operates, or how does it work?
Yeah, so I know the last time I checked so there's a tool called Font Tools, which is a Python tool that Glyphhanger uses behind the scenes. And they were adding support for subsetting variable fonts to a specific axis or multiple axes. And so I think the same problems will exist with variable fonts. if you want to do a first stage, you'll still probably do a single axis, and then you'll sort of lazy load the full variable font later, because variable fonts are going to be great. They're going to be great for reflows for sure, reducing reflows, combining all those fonts into one, but they're going to be bigger, right? So it will take longer to load. So it'll be a different problem, but you'll still see web font loading problems with variable fonts for sure.
So it looks like web fonts are not going away, and the issues related to them won't go away either. I guess that web fonts or something around web fonts will also be a topic of your conversation, of your talk, sorry, in Austin on June 9th and 10th. So what will we be expecting from you? The ultimate solution to all of our issues and problems forever, one and all? Or is it a little bit too much, promised a little bit too much?
No, I think that there will be a short number of best cases that we can work with to make things easier for people. And then there's always going to be a range of solutions, from the low-hanging fruit to the advanced power user implementations that need the most speed that they can get. So yeah, I think that we can sort of help out everyone here. We can give the beginners or the introductory font loading to as many people as want it, and then we can have some nice power user solutions as well. So.
But wouldn't be the ultimate solution just avoid web fonts?
Use system fonts?
Yeah, because why not? I mean, this would be like an ultimate solution to all kind of web font loading issues, right?
Yep, and that's why I only eat Soylent. I have one flavor of food is good enough for everyone, and I don't need any variety in my life. So.
Yeah, well, your favorite color is green anyway, so it's fine. So you have the ultimate
Yeah,
color. You've chosen.
You got me.
Yeah,
Yep,
I see.
you
So
got me there.
everything is resolved now. Okay, the final question and the most important one, maybe. There are so many things happening, and I know that you actually, of course, you are dealing with web fonts and you like all those little web fonts issues. But if you look around and think about everything that's happening on the web, what are you most excited about these days? What really keeps you awake at night? Or maybe a problem you'd like to see solved for good, except
Yeah,
fonts.
yeah, if you ignore progressive font enrichment, that's like the number one thing I'm excited about when it comes to font loading. But I think in terms of outside of the font loading world, I'm really excited about Jamstack and how it's sort of democratizing sort of back end, and allowing front end developers more power in what they can do on the end. And not just that, but the performance implications of Jamstack, I think, are very, very interesting, where we can sort of just like the old days, just put some HTML on a GitHub, and it'll deploy out to the cloud, and we get a whole bunch of performance benefits out of that. So we can make really, really fast sites on Jamstack, and I'm really excited about the possibilities there.
That sounds very exciting. This is something I just switched the screens in the wrong way. This is how professional I am. I think that this is something we're going to hear a lot about, but we're also going to hear you speaking about web fonts first. So this is kind of the more important one. Okay, so I think we're good for now. Thank you so much, Tech, for joining us. I'm hoping that you will be returning back to your green world with your green colleagues and say hello to everyone.
Green grass outside.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And with this in mind, I'm signing off. Thank you for joining, and everyone, thanks for joining as well. Hope to see you in Austin. And signing off. Bye, Zach.
Thank you. Bye.